Summer nights in Eugene, Oregon carried the scent of Douglas fir and possibility in 1983, when college students filled the streets, and the Willamette Valley felt safe enough to leave doors unlocked. On June 13th of that year, a Saturday that had been unremarkable in every way, someone walked into the warm darkness and never returned, leaving behind a mystery that would take 40 years to unravel and an entire community to confront what had been hiding in plain sight all along. The last person to see Steven Paul Brodie alive was his roommate, 22-year-old Michael Chen, who watched him leave their apartment on East 19th Avenue at approximately 9:45 on that Saturday night. Steven had been restless all evening, pacing their small living room while pretending to watch television, checking his watch with the kind of frequency that suggested he was either nervous about something or eager for it to begin. When Mike asked if everything was okay, Steven had smiled in that easy way he had, the smile that had made him popular since childhood, and said he was just meeting someone for a drink, nothing important. He'd be back before midnight. He was wearing his favorite denim jacket despite the warmth of the evening, the one with the Grateful Dead patch his sister had sewn onto the back, and his keys jingled in his pocket as he pulled the apartment door closed behind him. Mike heard his footsteps descending the wooden stairs, heard the building's front door open and close, and then returned to studying for a chemistry exam he had on Monday, thinking nothing of his roommate's departure because Steven often went out on Saturday nights and always came home with stories about whoever he'd met or whatever small adventure Eugene had offered up. By 2 a.m, Mike had fallen asleep on the couch with his textbook open across his chest. By 8 the next morning, when he woke with a stiff neck and the sun streaming through their east-facing windows, he realized Steven's bedroom door was still open, the bed still made, exactly as it had been the night before. This wasn't entirely unusual. Steven occasionally stayed over at a friend's place or got caught up in some late-night conversation that stretched into dawn, but something about the pristine condition of the room, the way the morning light fell across the undisturbed bedspread, made Mike uneasy in a way he couldn't immediately articulate. He called Steven's girlfriend, 20-year-old Jennifer Morrison, who lived in a dorm on campus. She hadn't seen him, hadn't expected to see him, they didn't have plans. She asked if everything was all right, and Mike said yes, probably, just checking, and hung up feeling foolish for worrying. He called 2 other friends who Steven sometimes went drinking with. Neither had seen him. One said he thought Steven had mentioned meeting someone new, maybe a girl from one of his classes, but he couldn't remember the details because they'd been talking at a party the week before, and the music had been loud and his memory fuzzy with cheap beer. By Monday morning, when Steven hadn't returned and hadn't called and didn't show up for his shift at the campus bookstore, where he'd worked part-time for 2 years and had never missed a day without notice, Mike Chen walked into the Eugene Police Department and filed a missing persons report. The officer who took the report, a 38-year-old patrol officer named David Wilkins, wrote down the information with practiced efficiency, asking the standard questions while maintaining the standard expression of professional concern that revealed nothing about what he actually thought. How long had Steven been missing? Since Saturday night, approximately 58 hours. Had there been any arguments or signs of distress? No, nothing unusual, just a normal evening. Did Steven have any history of drug use or mental health issues? Not that Mike knew of. Steven smoked marijuana occasionally like everyone else, but nothing serious. Had he taken anything with him? His keys, his wallet presumably, the clothes he was wearing, his car? Steven didn't own a car. He rode a bicycle everywhere, or walked. Was the bicycle still at the apartment? Yes, locked to the railing outside where it always was. Officer Wilkins explained that most missing persons cases involving young adults resolved themselves within 72 hours, that people often needed to clear their heads or deal with personal issues and returned on their own, that there was probably a simple explanation. But he took the report seriously because that was his job, and he noted that Steven Paul Brodie was 21 years old, 5 feet 10 inches tall, approximately 165 pounds, brown hair, blue eyes, last seen wearing a denim jacket and jeans, leaving his apartment on East 19th Avenue on Saturday, June 13th, at approximately 9:45 in the evening. The investigation that followed in those first crucial days was thorough by 1983 standards, but hampered by the limitations of pre-digital record-keeping and the reality that Eugene in the early 80s was A college town where young people came and went with considerable fluidity, and privacy was still considered more important than surveillance. Detective Robert Krause caught the case on Monday afternoon when it became clear that Steven wasn't going to walk through his apartment door with an apology and a reasonable explanation. Krause was 43, had been with Eugene PD for 18 years, and had worked missing persons cases before. Most of them ended with the person showing up embarrassed or defiant, occasionally with them being found in a hospital after an accident, rarely but memorably with them being found dead from misadventure or suicide, or the kind of random violence that could happen anywhere, but felt particularly shocking in a place like Eugene that prided itself on being safe and progressive, and fundamentally decent. He started with Steven's apartment, which Mike had left untouched since Sunday morning when he'd first started to worry. Steven's bedroom was small and neat, in the way of someone who'd been raised to pick up after himself. His bed made with military corners that suggested his father's influence. His desk organized with textbooks stacked by size and notebooks labeled by course. There was a calendar on the wall, marked with class times and work shifts, nothing unusual circled or highlighted for June 13th. His closet held the modest wardrobe of a college student operating on a limited budget, everything clean and hung or folded properly. What struck Krause as he searched the room was how present Steven's life was, how completely his possessions suggested someone planning to return. His wallet was gone, but his checkbook was in the desk drawer. His toothbrush was in the bathroom. His laundry hamper held clothes that would need washing soon. His alarm clock was set for 7 in the morning, the time he usually woke up for early classes. This was not the room of someone planning to disappear, planning to start over somewhere else, planning anything except the continuation of a normal life that had been interrupted mid-sentence. Krause interviewed Jennifer Morrison in her dorm room on Monday evening. She was composed but clearly frightened, her hands twisting a tissue in her lap as she answered his questions. She and Steven had been dating for 8 months, since they'd met in an American literature class the previous fall. The relationship was good, she said. They were happy. They'd talked about maybe moving in together next year after she graduated. There hadn't been any fights or tension lately, nothing that would make her think he was unhappy or planning to leave. She described Steven as easygoing and well-liked, someone who made friends easily but kept most people at a comfortable distance, revealing himself slowly and only to those he trusted. He was studying history with vague plans to maybe teach or maybe go to law school. He hadn't decided yet, and didn't seem worried about deciding. He liked hiking in the Cascades, liked playing guitar badly, liked reading science fiction novels and arguing about politics with anyone who'd engage. He drank socially but not heavily, smoked marijuana occasionally but wasn't what anyone would call a stoner, had never mentioned any trouble with dealers or debts or anything criminal. When Krause asked if Steven had mentioned meeting anyone on Saturday night, Jennifer's expression shifted slightly, something flickering across her face that might have been confusion or hurt or sudden realization. He'd said something about meeting a friend for a drink, she said slowly, but he'd been vague about it and she'd thought it was odd because Steven was usually specific about his plans, usually told her exactly where he'd be in case she wanted to stop by. She'd actually felt slightly bothered by the vagueness, had wondered if maybe he was meeting another girl, but had pushed the thought away because she trusted him and didn't want to be the kind of girlfriend who needed to know everything. Krause asked if she could think of anyone Steven might have been meeting, anyone he'd mentioned recently or seemed interested in. She thought for a long moment, her eyes distant, and then shook her head. There was a teaching assistant in one of his classes he'd mentioned once or twice, she said. Someone named David or Daniel, maybe. They'd had coffee to discuss a paper Steven was writing. But that had been weeks ago, and Steven hadn't mentioned him since. There was his coworker at the bookstore, older guy who'd lived in Eugene forever and liked to talk about local history. There was his study group for economics, 3 or 4 other students whose names she couldn't remember. But no one who stood out as significant, no one who seemed like someone Steven would be secretive about meeting. Steven Paul Brodie had been born in Portland on March 27, 1962, the second of 3 children to Robert and Margaret Brodie, who'd moved to Eugene when Steven was 7 years old so his father could take a position as an engineering professor at the University of Oregon. The family had settled into a comfortable ranch house in the South Hills, the kind of neighborhood where children rode bicycles in packs, and parents knew each other well enough to borrow sugar and keep an eye on wandering kids without being asked. By all accounts, Steven had been an easy child, neither particularly rebellious nor excessively compliant, occupying that middle ground of temperament that made him pleasant to be around without demanding too much attention. His older sister, Catherine, remembered him as the peacemaker between her and their younger brother, Thomas, the one who could diffuse their arguments with a joke or a well-timed distraction, who seemed to understand instinctively how to make people feel heard, even when he was too young to offer any actual solutions to their problems. He'd attended South Eugene High School, where he'd been neither popular nor unpopular, neither an outstanding student nor a struggling one. His grades were solid B's with occasional A's in subjects that interested him, history and literature mostly, though he'd struggled with mathematics despite his father's patient attempts at tutoring. He'd played JV basketball for 2 years before accepting that his lack of height and extraordinary talent meant he'd never make varsity, and he'd joined the school newspaper instead, writing occasional articles about student government and sports scores that demonstrated competent prose, but no particular flair for journalism. What people who knew Steven in high school remembered most was his laugh, which was genuine and frequent, and had a quality that made other people want to laugh along with him, even when they didn't quite get the joke. He had friends across different social groups. The jocks and the stoners and the theater kids all claimed him as one of theirs, which suggested someone with the rare ability to be comfortable anywhere without fully belonging anywhere. His best friend throughout high school had been Marcus Webb, whose family lived 3 houses down from the Brodies, and they'd spent countless afternoons in Marcus's garage teaching themselves guitar with varying degrees of success. After graduating in 1980, Steven had enrolled at the University of Oregon like many Eugene kids, whose families expected college but couldn't afford to send them far away. He'd lived in the dorms his freshman year, moved into an apartment with 2 roommates his sophomore year, and had been sharing the place on East 19th Avenue with Mike Chen since the beginning of his junior year. The arrangement worked well because both young men were reasonably neat, paid their bills on time, and understood the unspoken boundaries of shared living space. Steven's routine in the spring of 1983 had been predictable in the way of college students who'd figured out how to balance academics and work and social life without letting any one element overwhelm the others. He attended classes 3 days a week, worked at the campus bookstore, 4 afternoons, and all day Saturday. Spent Sunday mornings sleeping late, and Sunday afternoons at his parents' house for the family dinners. His mother insisted on maintaining, despite her children's busy schedules. He studied in the library most evenings, met Jennifer for lunch or coffee several times a week, played pickup basketball at the rec center when he could find a game. Those who worked alongside him at the university bookstore described Steven as reliable and pleasant, someone who showed up on time and didn't complain about the tedious work of shelving books and processing textbook returns and explaining the store's policies to confused freshmen. His supervisor, a woman named Carol Patterson, who'd managed the store for 12 years, said Steven was the kind of employee she could trust to open or close the store alone, which she rarely did with student workers because most of them were too distracted or immature to be given that much responsibility. He had ambitions, but they were vague and changeable in the way of 21-year-olds, who understood they needed to plan for the future, but weren't quite ready to commit to any specific path. He told his father he was thinking about law school, told his mother he might want to teach history at the high school level, told Jennifer he could see himself doing something in public service, though he wasn't sure what that meant exactly. His transcript showed someone exploring different subjects without yet discovering a calling, which his academic advisor considered perfectly normal for a junior who still had time to declare a major and figure things out. What made Steven's disappearance particularly devastating to those who knew him was precisely his ordinariness, his reliability, his lack of drama or risk-taking behavior. This was not a young man who dabbled in dangerous hobbies or associated with questionable people or lived on the edge of anything. He paid his rent, attended his classes, called his mother once a week, remembered his friends' birthdays. The idea that someone like Steven could simply vanish from a college town on a warm Saturday night seemed to violate some fundamental assumption about how the world worked, about who was safe and who was vulnerable, and whether ordinariness offered any protection at all. His parents, Robert and Margaret, held on to hope with the desperate intensity of people who understood intellectually that something terrible had probably happened, but couldn't allow themselves to accept it emotionally. Margaret called Detective Krause every other day in those first weeks, asking if there was news, offering information she thought might be relevant. Describing Steven's childhood illnesses, and his favorite foods, and the time he'd gotten lost at the state fair when he was 6, but had been found within an hour, safe and calm, waiting by the information booth, exactly where they'd told him to go if they ever got separated. Robert approached the situation more analytically, creating spreadsheets of Steven's known associates and timeline maps of his last known movements and lists of questions the police should be asking. It was his way of maintaining control over a situation that was fundamentally uncontrollable, of feeling like he was doing something productive, when in reality, there was nothing productive to be done, except wait and hope and try not to imagine the worst possibilities that his engineering mind couldn't help but calculate. Catherine, who was 24 and working as a graphic designer in Seattle, came home the week after Steven disappeared and stayed for a month, sleeping in her childhood bedroom and helping her parents field phone calls and coordinate search efforts and maintain the appearance of normal family functioning, even though nothing was normal anymore. She kept expecting Steven to call, kept hearing his voice in her head, making some joke about how worried everyone was getting over nothing, kept turning toward doors when they opened, with the irrational certainty that he'd be standing there with that sheepish smile and a story about where he'd been. Thomas, who was 19 and finishing his freshman year at Oregon State in Corvallis, drove home every weekend to help search the areas around campus and downtown Eugene where Steven might have gone. He walked the riverside paths and the wooded areas near the university and the neighborhoods where students lived, looking for any sign that his brother had passed through, had fallen, had needed help. He found nothing but became intimately familiar with his brother's absence, with the negative space Steven had left behind, with the way a person could be erased from the physical world while remaining overwhelmingly present in memory and fear. Jennifer Morrison struggled with a particular kind of guilt that came from being the girlfriend who hadn't known something was wrong, who'd accepted Steven's vague explanation about meeting someone for a drink and hadn't pressed for details, hadn't insisted on coming along, hadn't sensed that something was different about that Saturday night. She replayed their last conversation over and over, searching for clues she'd missed, warnings she should have heard, some indication that Steven was in trouble or afraid or planning something he couldn't tell her about. But the memory offered nothing except ordinariness, Steven being Steven, affectionate and distracted and unremarkable in every way. Detective Robert Krause began building Steven Brodie's last known movements with the methodical patience of someone who understood that missing persons cases were solved through accumulation of small details rather than dramatic breakthroughs. He obtained Steven's bank records and found that his last transaction had been a $20 withdrawal from an ATM on campus at 6:15 on Saturday evening, suggesting he'd needed cash for wherever he was going. The withdrawal location was consistent with Steven's normal patterns. He used that particular machine frequently, but the timing suggested premeditation, that he'd known he'd need money and had prepared accordingly. Krause interviewed everyone who'd seen Steven that Saturday. A student named Rachel Kim had been studying at the library and remembered seeing Steven there around 4 in the afternoon, sitting at his usual table near the reference section with his history textbook open and his notebook filling with his characteristic small, neat handwriting. She'd waved, he'd waved back. They hadn't spoken because the library had been crowded and quiet, and neither had any reason to interrupt their studying for conversation. She remembered nothing unusual about his demeanor, nothing that suggested anxiety or anticipation, or anything except a typical Saturday afternoon of academic work. The clerk at the campus bookstore, where Steven had worked his shift that morning from 9 until 2, remembered him being slightly distracted, checking his watch more often than usual, but attributed it to the normal restlessness of a college student on a weekend who'd rather be somewhere else. Steven had handled the register competently, helped several customers find textbooks, restocked a shelf of university apparel, and left at precisely 2 o'clock when his replacement arrived, calling out his usual cheerful goodbye as he pushed through the glass doors into the June sunshine. Mike Chen had already provided his account of the evening, but Krause interviewed him again, pressing for details that might have seemed insignificant at first recollection. Had Steven received any phone calls that day? Not that Mike remembered, though he'd been in and out of the apartment running errands, and Steven could have taken calls while he was gone. Had anyone come to the door? No. Had Steven mentioned any conflicts with anyone? Any arguments or tensions? Nothing Mike could recall. The teaching assistant, Jennifer, had mentioned. Did Mike know anything about him? only that Steven had worked with him on a paper about the Vietnam War and had seemed to think highly of his insights. Krause tracked down the teaching assistant, whose name was Daniel Walsh, and who was 27 years old, working on his doctorate in history while teaching undergraduate sections of American history survey courses. Walsh remembered Steven as a bright and engaged student who'd written an impressive paper analyzing the media's role in shaping public opinion about the war, but said they'd only met for coffee once, maybe 6 weeks earlier, and he hadn't seen or spoken to Steven since. He'd been out of town the weekend of June 13th, visiting his parents in Salem, and had witnesses who could verify his whereabouts. The search efforts in those first weeks were extensive and increasingly desperate. The Eugene Police Department organized volunteer search parties that combed the areas surrounding campus and downtown, walking in lines through Spencer Butte Park and Hendricks Park, and along the Willamette River paths where students often went to drink or smoke or find privacy. They searched abandoned buildings and construction sites, checked hospitals and homeless shelters, contacted police departments in surrounding counties in case Steven had been found injured or confused somewhere outside Eugene. Nothing emerged except the growing certainty that Steven Brodie had not simply wandered off or gotten lost or suffered some accident that would have left his body in a discoverable location. Whatever had happened to him had been deliberate and had been concealed, which transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into a likely homicide, even though Krause couldn't officially classify it as such without a body or clear evidence of foul play. By late July, Krause had interviewed more than 70 people connected to Steven's life and had found no clear suspects, no obvious motives, no satisfying narrative that explained the disappearance. There were persons of interest, individuals whose stories didn't quite align or whose alibis couldn't be fully verified, but interest was not evidence, and Krause needed evidence to build a case. One name that appeared repeatedly in witness statements was Michael Russo, a 34-year-old man who'd lived in Eugene for 12 years and worked at a downtown bar called the Driftwood, where university students often gathered. Several of Steven's friends mentioned that Steven had talked about Russo occasionally, described him as an interesting older guy who knew a lot about Eugene's history and counterculture scene, someone who'd been around during the hippie era and had stories about protests and communes and the way the city had changed. Steven had apparently found Russo fascinating in the way young people sometimes find older locals fascinating, as representatives of a more authentic or adventurous way of living. Krause interviewed Russo at the Driftwood on a Wednesday afternoon when the bar was nearly empty, just a few regulars nursing beers and watching a baseball game on the television mounted above the liquor shelves. Russo was lean and weathered, with the kind of face that made it hard to guess his exact age, lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth from years of sun exposure and hard living. He wore his graying hair pulled back in a ponytail and had the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin and unconcerned with others' opinions. He remembered Steven, he said, though not particularly well. The kid had come into the bar occasionally, usually with friends, sometimes alone, and they'd talked a few times about local history and music and politics. Russo had lived in Eugene since 1971, had been part of the Back to the Land movement, had owned a small organic farm outside town until it failed financially in the late 70s. He'd tended bar at the Driftwood for the past 5 years, lived alone in a small house near the Whiteacre neighborhood, kept mostly to himself, except for his work shifts and occasional weekend hikes in the Cascades. When Krause asked if Steven had been at the Driftwood on Saturday, June 13th, Russo thought for a moment and then shook his head. Saturday nights were busy, he said, hard to remember specific faces in the crowd, but he didn't recall seeing Steven that evening. Had Steven ever mentioned meeting someone, perhaps someone he'd met through Russo? Not that Russo remembered. Had Steven seemed troubled or worried about anything the last time they'd talked? Russo couldn't say. Their conversations had been casual, superficial, the kind of bar talk that filled time without meaning much. Krause noted that Russo's answers were cooperative but vague, offering nothing useful but nothing overtly suspicious either. He asked Russo if he'd be willing to account for his whereabouts on June 13th. Russo said he'd worked his regular shift at the Driftwood from 6 in the evening until 2 in the morning, then had gone home alone. The bar's owner and other staff could verify he'd been working, though the busy Saturday night meant no one could say for certain whether he'd left the bar at any point during his shift. Background checks on Russo revealed a minor criminal record, a marijuana possession charge from 1973, and a drunk driving arrest from 1979, neither recent enough or serious enough to raise immediate red flags. He'd never been arrested for violence, had no history of sexual offenses or assaults. His co-workers at the Driftwood described him as reliable and competent, someone who handled drunk customers with calm authority and never seemed rattled by the chaos of weekend nights. But something about Russo nagged at Krause, some instinct developed over 18 years of police work that sensed discrepancy between what people said and what they meant. Russo had been too casual, too vague, too unconcerned about a young man he'd supposedly found interesting enough to have multiple conversations with. Most people, when told that someone they knew had vanished under mysterious circumstances, displayed genuine shock or concern, or at least curiosity. Russo had displayed mild regret, the kind someone might feel about a casual acquaintance they'd never really known. And it felt wrong for someone Steven's friends described as a person Steven had actively sought out for conversation. Krause requested Russo's phone records and found nothing unusual, mostly calls to the bar and to a few local numbers belonging to friends or former girlfriends. He had officers drive past Russo's house at irregular intervals, watching for anything suspicious. But Russo's life appeared exactly as mundane as he described it: work and home and occasional errands. Nothing that suggested criminal activity or guilty conscience. Another person of interest emerged through Jennifer Morrison, who remembered after several interviews that Steven had mentioned someone named Chris, or maybe Craig, who worked at a record store downtown. Steven had apparently spent time there, browsing albums and talking music with this person. Enough that Jennifer had felt vaguely jealous of the connection, even though Steven insisted it was just friendly conversation about bands and concerts. Krause located the record store, a place called Rare Tracks, that sold used vinyl and bootleg recordings, and found that a man named Christopher Bell had worked there until mid-June when he'd quit suddenly and moved to California. The store's owner said Bell had been a decent employee but flaky, the kind of person who'd show up late or call in sick with implausible excuses, and his sudden departure hadn't been surprising. He'd mentioned wanting to try his luck in San Francisco or maybe Los Angeles, said something about the music scene being dead in Eugene and needing to be somewhere more alive. The owner had no forwarding address and no way to contact Bell, who'd been paid cash under the table and had never filled out proper employment paperwork. Krause contacted law enforcement in California and requested that they attempt to locate Christopher Bell, providing the limited description the record store owner could offer: white male, mid-20s, approximately 6 feet tall, thin build, brown hair, usually worn long, multiple ear piercings. The search yielded several possible matches, but none that could be definitively confirmed as the same Christopher Bell who'd worked at Rare Tracks, and none of the Christopher Bells located in California had any connection to Eugene or Steven Brodie that investigators could establish. The absence of Bell became its own kind of evidence, suspicious in its timing, but Krause couldn't build a case on someone who might not exist, or might exist under a different name, or might have simply been a temporary employee of a record store who'd moved on with his life in the natural way people in their 20s moved on. Without Bell to interview, without any evidence connecting him to Steven beyond casual conversations about music, the lead dissolved into one more frustrating dead end. As summer turned to fall and the university filled again with returning students who knew nothing about Steven Brodie's disappearance, Krause continued working the case with diminishing resources and support. His captain gently suggested that perhaps it was time to accept that without a body or a witness or some break in the evidence, the case might never be solved. Other crimes demanded attention, other victims needed justice, and the department couldn't afford to keep dedicating significant manpower to an investigation that had gone cold. The official status changed from active investigation to open case in November of 1983, meaning Krause would continue following any new leads that emerged, but would no longer be working the case full-time. The file went into a cabinet in the Detective Bureau, joining dozens of other unsolved disappearances and murders that stretched back through Eugene's history, each one representing someone's unanswered questions and unfinished grief. The community's attention moved on the way it always did, though Steven's disappearance left a residue of unease that persisted through the academic year. Parents of university students called more frequently to check in. Young women were more cautious about walking alone at night. The bars and parties that had seemed innocent took on a slightly more sinister cast, Everyone aware now that terrible things could happen even in Eugene, even to people who did everything right. The 1990s arrived, with the particular cruelty of time that continues moving forward regardless of unresolved grief, and the Brodie family learned to carry Steven's absence the way people carry chronic pain, always present, but manageable enough that life could continue around it. Margaret Brodie had Steven declared legally dead in 1990, 7 years after his disappearance, because the financial complications of his ambiguous status had become untenable, and because some part of her needed the official acknowledgement that her son was not coming back, even though another part of her would spend the rest of her life listening for his footsteps on the front porch. The declaration felt like murder, like she'd killed him herself by signing papers that transformed him from missing to deceased. But it allowed her to access the small life insurance policy they'd taken out on all 3 children years earlier, and to close Steven's bank accounts, and to settle the various legal matters that had been frozen in bureaucratic limbo. The death certificate listed the cause as unknown, and the date as June 13th, 1983, which was accurate enough even though nobody actually knew when Steven had died, or how or where his body might be resting. Robert Brodie retired from his position at the university in 1992 and found that without the structure of work to occupy his days, his mind returned obsessively to Steven's disappearance, running through the same unanswerable questions that had haunted him for 9 years. He created new spreadsheets and timeline maps, updated them with information from occasional news stories about other cold cases being solved, convinced himself that some detail he'd missed might suddenly reveal itself if he just looked at the evidence from the right angle. Margaret watched him disappear into Steven's case the way she'd watched Steven disappear into that June night, helpless to prevent either loss. Catherine married in 1994 and moved to Portland with her husband, a software engineer who'd never known Steven and therefore didn't carry the weight of his absence into their relationship. She had 2 children by the end of the decade and found herself grateful that they would never have to grow up in the shadow of their missing uncle, would never have to navigate family gatherings where Steven's name hung unspoken in the air like smoke. She loved her parents, but visiting them required an emotional preparation that exhausted her, the effort of being cheerful and present while the ghost of her brother occupied the chair where he should have been sitting. Thomas graduated from Oregon State in 1987 and took a job with an environmental consulting firm in Seattle, deliberately choosing a city far enough from Eugene that he wouldn't have to drive past the places Steven had lived and worked and vanished from. He dated occasionally but struggled with commitment, couldn't shake the feeling that getting too close to anyone was dangerous, that people disappeared and left you with nothing but questions and the terrible weight of not knowing. He went to therapy in his 30s after a girlfriend insisted, and the therapist helped him understand that he'd been 17 when Steven vanished, still developing his understanding of how the world worked, and that trauma at that age shaped everything that came after. Detective Robert Krause retired from Eugene Police Department in 2000 after 35 years of service, and Steven Brodie's case remained the one he couldn't let go of completely. He kept a copy of the file in his home office, occasionally pulled it out to review when he couldn't sleep, or when some news story about a cold case being solved made him wonder if he'd missed something obvious. He'd worked hundreds of cases over 3.5 decades, but Steven's disappearance remained the one that haunted him most, perhaps because it had been so completely inexplicable. No body, no witnesses, no satisfying narrative that made sense of what had happened. The case was reviewed periodically by new detectives who inherited the cold case files, each one bringing fresh eyes and modern investigative techniques to evidence that had been collected in an era before DNA databases and cell phone records and digital surveillance. In 2003, a detective named Sarah Chen spent 6 months reviewing the Brodie case, re-interviewing witnesses who were still alive and locatable, running names through updated criminal databases, looking for connections that might have been invisible in 1983. She found Michael Russo still living in Eugene, still tending bar though at a different establishment now, still maintaining the same vague, cooperative demeanor he'd shown Krause 20 years earlier. Chen interviewed him at his home, a small house in the Whiteacre neighborhood that he'd purchased in the mid-90s, finding it cluttered but clean, filled with books and old vinyl records and the accumulated possessions of someone who'd lived in the same place for years without much thought toward organization or aesthetics. Russo remembered the Brodie case, he said, though the details had faded with time. He'd felt terrible about what happened to Steven, had thought about it occasionally over the years, wondered what had become of the investigation. Chen asked if he'd be willing to provide a DNA sample for comparison against evidence from unsolved cases, a routine request they were making of anyone connected to old investigations, now that DNA technology had advanced so dramatically. Russo agreed without hesitation, drove to the police station the next day, and submitted to the cheek swab, signed the consent forms, asked if there was anything else he could do to help. The DNA went into the Oregon State database but matched nothing, which meant either Russo had never committed any crime that left biological evidence, or the crime that had taken Steven Brodie hadn't left any recoverable DNA. Chen's review concluded the same way Krause's original investigation had concluded, with persons of interest but no concrete evidence, with questions but no answers, with the case remaining frustratingly unsolved despite her best efforts. Christopher Bell, the record store employee who disappeared to California around the time Steven vanished, was never located despite periodic attempts to find him over the years. The name was common enough that searching for him without more specific identifying information was nearly impossible, and the pre-internet era meant no digital footprint existed to trace. He remained a ghost in the investigation, someone who might have been significant or might have been completely irrelevant, but his absence from the evidence file a permanent void that could never be adequately explained. Margaret Brodie died in 2009 of complications from pneumonia, and at her funeral, Catherine and Thomas stood beside their father and understood that their mother had spent 26 years waiting for Steven to come home, that some essential part of her had remained frozen in June of 1983, no matter how competently she'd continued living her life. The eulogy mentioned her dedication to family and community but didn't mention Steven by name, which felt wrong to those who knew how completely his disappearance had defined her remaining years. Robert followed his wife in 2012, a heart attack while working in his garage on a Saturday morning, and when Catherine and Thomas cleaned out their childhood home, they found boxes filled with Steven's belongings that Margaret had never been able to give away or throw out. His high school yearbooks and college textbooks, his denim jacket with the Grateful Dead patch, his guitar that he'd played badly but enthusiastically, his basketball from sophomore year, with his teammates' signatures fading on the synthetic leather. They donated most of it to Goodwill, kept a few items for themselves and for their own children, understood that they were now the only ones left who remembered Steven as a real person rather than a mystery. Jennifer Morrison had married in 1991, a man she'd met at work who knew about Steven but didn't press her for details beyond what she volunteered. She had 3 children and built a successful career as a physical therapist, and only occasionally found herself thinking about that Saturday night in June when Steven had kissed her goodbye and walked out into the warm darkness. She'd learned to live with the guilt of not knowing something was wrong, had accepted that there was nothing she could have done differently, but the question of what had happened to him remained a small, sharp stone she carried inside, occasionally shifting to remind her of its presence. Mike Chen had moved to California in 1985, unable to continue living in Eugene, where everything reminded him of his missing roommate. He'd finished his degree at UC Berkeley and become a pharmacist, married, divorced, married again, built a life that had nothing to do with Oregon, or the University of Oregon, or the apartment on East 19th Avenue where he'd last seen Steven alive. But he never forgot the sound of Steven's keys jingling as he pulled the door closed, never stopped feeling that he should have asked more questions, should have insisted on knowing where Steven was going and who he was meeting, should have somehow prevented whatever terrible thing had happened in the hours after Steven descended those wooden stairs. By 2015, Steven Brodie's disappearance had faded into Eugene's collective memory, alongside countless other tragedies and mysteries. The kind of story older residents might mention when discussing the city's history, but younger people knew nothing about. The university had changed. The downtown had been renovated and gentrified. The bars where Steven had spent Saturday nights were under new ownership or had closed entirely. The physical spaces he'd occupied had been transformed by time and commerce until almost nothing remained of the Eugene he'd known except the geography itself, the mountains and rivers that persisted regardless of human tragedy. Detective Sarah Chen, who'd reviewed the case in 2003, was promoted to sergeant in 2018 and inherited responsibility for the cold case unit. She assembled a small team of investigators and analysts tasked with reviewing unsolved homicides and disappearances using modern forensic techniques, particularly forensic genealogy, which had begun solving decades-old cases across the country with remarkable success. The Brodie case was on her list of priorities, but the lack of biological evidence meant genealogy wasn't an option, at least not yet. Not unless some new evidence emerged that could be tested against familial DNA databases. The call came to Sergeant Sarah Chen's desk on a Thursday morning in March of 2023 from a construction foreman named David Torres, who was overseeing the renovation of an old warehouse building in the Whiteacre neighborhood that was being converted into expensive loft apartments. His crew had been demolishing interior walls when they'd discovered a space that wasn't on any of the building's architectural plans, a narrow cavity between the original exterior wall and a false wall that had been constructed at some point decades earlier, creating a hidden gap approximately 18 inches wide that ran the length of the building's eastern side. Inside that gap, wrapped in deteriorating plastic sheeting and hidden beneath decades of accumulated dust and debris, they'd found what appeared to be human remains. Torres had immediately stopped work and called 911, and the responding officers had secured the scene and contacted the detective division, which was how Chen found herself driving across town on a gray March morning to examine what might be the answer to a question the city had been asking for 40 years. The warehouse had been built in 1967 and had served various purposes over the decades, most recently as storage for a commercial furniture company that had gone bankrupt in 2019. The building had sat empty for 3 years before a Portland development company purchased it and began the renovation that would transform it into 12 luxury residential units targeting young professionals who wanted to live in Eugene's historically bohemian neighborhood. The false wall, according to the building's history that Torres had researched, had been added sometime in the early 1980s as part of an insulation upgrade, which meant whoever had hidden the remains had done so during a narrow window when construction work would have provided access and cover. Chen arrived to find the scene already cordoned off with police tape, patrol officers keeping curious neighbors, and passing pedestrians at a safe distance. She suited up in protective gear and entered the building through the main entrance, which opened into a large open space where exposed brick and original timber beams suggested the architectural character the developers were hoping to market. The false wall section had been partially removed, creating an opening through which Chen could see the narrow cavity and the plastic-wrapped bundle that lay at the bottom like something discarded and forgotten. The medical examiner, a woman named Dr. Patricia Moss, who'd held the position for 15 years and had seen her share of bodies in various states of decomposition, arrived 30 minutes later. Together, they supervised the careful extraction of the remains, photographing everything in place before moving anything, documenting the exact position and condition of what they were finding. The plastic sheeting was brittle with age, but had done its job of protecting the contents from moisture and insects, which meant the skeletal remains were largely intact, still partially clothed in fabric that had survived better than anyone might have expected. The clothing was what caught Chen's attention first, specifically the denim jacket that was visible once they'd carefully unwrapped the outer plastic layer. The jacket was weathered and stained but recognizably vintage 1980s style, and when they turned it carefully to examine the back, Chen felt her breath catch in her throat. There, faded but still visible, was a Grateful Dead patch sewn onto the faded denim, a dancing skeleton in red and blue that matched exactly the description in Steven Brodie's missing persons file. Dr. Moss transported the remains to her lab, where she began the process of forensic examination that would take several days to complete thoroughly. The skeleton was male, belonged to someone in their late teens or early 20s at time of death, stood approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall. The bones showed no obvious signs of trauma, no fractures or cut marks that would indicate violent struggle, but Moss noted that the hyoid bone in the throat area showed damage consistent with strangulation, a finding that transformed this from a suspicious death into a likely homicide. Dental records provided confirmation within 48 hours. The remains were Steven Paul Brodie, missing since June 13, 1983. He found less than a mile from the apartment where he'd lived, and the campus where he'd studied, and the life he'd been building before someone had taken it from him and hidden his body in a wall where it might have remained. Hidden forever, if not for gentrification and the economic forces that had made the Whiteacre neighborhood attractive to developers. Chen sat in her office with the case files spread across her desk, all 700 pages of reports and interviews and dead ends that Krause had accumulated, and began the process of reviewing everything with the knowledge of where Steven's body had been found. The warehouse location was significant, she realized, because it was owned in 1983 by a man named Walter Kemp, who'd operated a woodworking business on the ground floor and lived in an apartment on the second floor. Kemp had died in 2006, which meant he couldn't be interviewed, but Chen pulled his background and found nothing remarkable. A 74-year-old widower who'd lived alone and kept to himself and had no criminal record beyond a drunk driving charge in 1979. But Kemp had employed several part-time workers in his woodworking business over the years, and Chen began tracking down anyone who'd worked at the warehouse in 1983. Most were dead or untraceable after 4 decades, but she found 2 names that made her pause. One was Christopher Bell, listed on informal payroll records as having done odd jobs and deliveries for Kemp from April through June of 1983, paid in cash, no tax documents filed. The other was Michael Russo, who'd apparently worked for Kemp briefly in early 1983, helping with furniture deliveries and warehouse maintenance. Russo's name appearing again after all these years felt like a pattern finally revealing itself, like seeing a constellation emerge from random stars. Chen pulled everything they had on Russo and discovered he was now 71 years old, still living in the same house in the Whiteacre neighborhood, less than 3 blocks from the warehouse where Steven's body had been found. He'd worked various service jobs over the decades, currently worked part-time at a hardware store, lived alone, had been divorced twice, had no children, maintained a low profile that suggested someone deliberately avoiding attention. The forensic evidence from Steven's remains was limited by decomposition and time. But Dr. Moss had collected samples from the clothing and from beneath what remained of fingernails, material that went to the Oregon State Crime Lab for DNA analysis. The technology that hadn't existed in 1983 now offered possibilities that seemed almost miraculous. The ability to extract genetic material from microscopic samples and compare it against databases containing millions of profiles from convicted offenders and crime scenes across the country. Chen requested a warrant to obtain a fresh DNA sample from Michael Russo, citing his connection to both the victim and the location where the body was found, his presence in the original investigation as a person of interest, and the suspicious timing of his employment at the warehouse. A judge granted the warrant on a Monday morning, and Chen drove to Russo's house with 2 other detectives, arriving at 7 in the morning when she knew he'd most likely be home. Russo answered the door in sweatpants and a faded t-shirt, looking older than his 71 years, his face deeply lined and his hair now completely gray and thinning. He looked at Chen's badge and at the officers behind her, and something flickered across his expression. Resignation, maybe, or relief, or the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been waiting for this moment for 40 years. He invited them inside without asking what they wanted, as if he already knew, and sat in his cluttered living room while Chen explained about the warehouse and the remains and the DNA sample they needed him to provide. He agreed without protest, allowed them to swab the inside of his cheek, signed the consent forms with a hand that trembled slightly from age or nerves, or some combination of both. Chen asked if he remembered working at Walter Kemp's warehouse in 1983, and Russo said, yes. He remembered. It had been a short-term thing, just a few months of part-time work, helping with deliveries and odd jobs. Did he remember Steven Brodie? Yes, he remembered the kid from the bar. Terrible thing what happened to him. Did he remember anything unusual about the warehouse during the time he worked there? Russo's eyes met Chen's and held them for a long moment before he shook his head slowly and said nothing unusual, just a normal job, normal workplace, nothing to remember after all these years. The DNA sample went to the lab with a priority flag, and the results came back in 11 days. The genetic material recovered from beneath Steven's fingernails matched Michael Russo's profile with a probability of 99.97%, meaning that in the moments before he died, Steven Brodie had struggled with his killer and had carried evidence of that struggle beneath his fingernails for 40 years, waiting for technology to catch up with justice. Chen assembled her team and spent 3 days preparing for the interrogation, reviewing every piece of evidence, every witness statement, building a timeline that would make sense of what had happened in June of 1983. They obtained a second warrant, this one for Russo's arrest, and executed it on a Tuesday morning when Russo was leaving for his shift at the hardware store. He didn't resist, didn't seem surprised, simply allowed himself to be handcuffed and read his rights and placed in the back of a patrol car for the drive to the Eugene Police Department. The interrogation room was small and windowless, painted the institutional beige that was meant to be calming but instead made everything feel slightly oppressive. Chen sat across from Russo with Detective James Park beside her, both of them maintaining the professional calm that came from years of interviewing suspects, the ability to seem simultaneously sympathetic and implacable. Russo had declined a lawyer, which surprised Chen given his age and the severity of what he was facing, but suggested someone who'd perhaps made peace with consequences he'd known were eventually coming. They started gently, asking Russo to recount his movements on June 13th, 1983, giving him rope to either hang himself or tell a truth that had been buried for 4 decades. Russo sat quietly for several minutes, his hands folded on the table in front of him, his breathing slow and measured. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but steady, carrying the particular quality of someone relieved to finally unburden himself of weight he'd carried too long. He'd known Steven from the bar, he said. They'd talked occasionally about music and politics and the kinds of things people talked about in bars when they were killing time and filling silence. Steven had been curious about him, about his past, about the commune he'd lived on in the 70s and the counterculture scene that had mostly died out by the 80s. Russo had found the attention flattering, had liked feeling like someone interesting rather than just another aging burnout tending bar to pay rent. In early June, Steven had asked if he could interview Russo for a paper he was writing about the evolution of Eugene's radical politics from the 60s through the present. Russo had agreed, and they'd met several times at the warehouse where Russo was working, conducting the interviews in the evening after Kemp had gone upstairs to his apartment and the building was quiet. The conversations had been stimulating, had made Russo feel relevant and important in a way he hadn't felt in years. On June 13th, they'd arranged to meet again, one final session to wrap up Steven's research. Steven had arrived around 10 that evening, after the bar where Russo supposedly worked had been busy enough that no one would remember whether he'd actually been there or not. They'd talked in the warehouse workshop area, sitting on workbenches, surrounded by sawdust and wood scraps and the tools of Kemp's trade. Russo's voice became quieter as he described what happened next, how the conversation had shifted from academic interview to something more personal, how Steven had asked questions about Russo's life that felt too probing, too judgmental. Steven had apparently discovered something in his research, some detail about Russo's past that Russo had never shared, something about a girl who disappeared from the commune in 1972 under circumstances that had never been fully explained. Steven hadn't accused Russo directly, but his questions had made it clear what he was thinking, what conclusions he'd drawn. Russo said he'd panicked, had felt everything he'd built over a decade threatened by a 21-year-old kid who thought he understood things he couldn't possibly understand. They'd argued, voices rising, and when Steven had said he needed to take his research to the police, he needed to ask questions about the girl from 1972. Russo had reacted without thinking. He'd grabbed Steven from behind, wrapped his arm around the young man's throat, held on while Steven struggled and clawed and fought for air that wouldn't come. It had been over in minutes, Russo said, his voice now barely above a whisper. Steven had gone limp, and Russo had lowered him to the floor and sat there in the darkness, listening to his own ragged breathing and understanding that he'd just murdered someone and destroyed whatever remained of his own soul. He'd waited until after midnight, until he was certain Kemp was asleep upstairs and the street outside was empty. And then he'd wrapped Steven's body in plastic sheeting from the workshop supplies and hidden it in the gap behind the wall that he knew existed because he'd helped Kemp with the insulation project just weeks earlier. Chen listened without interrupting, letting Russo tell the story his way, waiting until he'd finished before asking the questions that would fill in the remaining gaps. What had happened to the girl from the commune in 1972? Russo said she'd left on her own, just packed up one day and hitched a ride to California. There'd been no crime, nothing sinister. But Steven had been convinced otherwise, and Russo hadn't been able to make him understand. Was that the truth? Russo met Chen's eyes and after a long moment shook his head slowly, said the truth was, he couldn't remember anymore what had actually happened and what he'd convinced himself had happened. That 40 years of living with Steven's murder had corrupted his memory of everything that came before. The confession was recorded and transcribed and would form the basis of the prosecution's case, though the physical evidence alone would have been sufficient for conviction. Russo was charged with second-degree murder and held without bail, and the news of his arrest spread through Eugene within hours, shocking a community that had half forgotten Steven Brodie's name, but remembered the mystery of his disappearance and the questions that had never been answered. Catherine and Thomas Brodie received the news on a Thursday afternoon in March of 2023, 40 years minus 3 months from the night their brother had walked into warm darkness and never returned. Sergeant Sarah Chen made the calls herself, her voice carrying the weight of decades and the strange relief that comes with terrible answers being better than no answers at all. Steven had been found, his remains identified, his killer arrested and charged. The mystery that had shaped their entire adult lives was no longer a mystery, though the knowledge brought no joy, only a kind of exhausted completion. The trial came 6 months later, in September of 2023, and lasted only 3 days because Michael Russo pleaded guilty rather than force Steven's family to endure the testimony and evidence that would recreate his final moments. The judge sentenced him to 25 years to life, which at 71 years old meant he would almost certainly die in prison, and no one in the courtroom felt satisfaction or triumph. Only the hollow acknowledgement that justice this delayed was hardly justice at all. Steven was buried in October on a Saturday morning when the leaves were turning gold and red across the Willamette Valley, laid to rest in a cemetery plot beside his parents who died never knowing what happened to their son. Catherine and Thomas stood at the graveside with their families, with Jennifer Morrison, who'd remained Jennifer Morrison and never remarried after her first marriage failed, with Mike Chen, who'd flown in from California and wept openly for the roommate whose keys he could still hear jingling 4 decades later. The warehouse in the Whiteacre neighborhood was eventually completed and filled with young professionals who knew nothing about what had been hidden in its walls, though a small plaque near the entrance commemorates Steven Paul Brodie and the 40 years he spent concealed behind false construction while the city changed and grew around him. The plaque doesn't explain the details, doesn't offer the full story, just marks the space as significant in some way that passers-by rarely stop to consider. Eugene remembers Steven now not as a mystery but as a victim, another name in the long catalog of lives cut short by violence and concealment. And when summer nights arrive carrying the scent of Douglas fir and possibility, some still think about the college student who walked into warm darkness in 1983 and the 4 decades it took for truth to emerge from shadows. Time cannot undo what was done or restore what was lost, cannot give Catherine and Thomas back, the brother they grew up missing, or return to Steven, the future that was stolen from him, on a June night when he was 21 years old and believed the world was fundamentally safe. But time did eventually yield answers, and in a case defined by absence and unknowing, even delayed truth carries its own measure of grace. The question that haunted everyone who knew about Steven Brodie's case wasn't really about how he'd been found or even why he'd been killed, but rather about the girl from the commune in 1972. The shadow case that had set everything in motion and had never been properly investigated because Michael Russo's confession had been vague and self-serving and potentially designed to obscure a truth even darker than Steven's murder. Sergeant Sarah Chen couldn't let it go. After Russo was sentenced and transferred to the Oregon State Penitentiary where he'd spend whatever remained of his life, she began researching the commune he'd mentioned, a place called New Dawn that had existed on 40 acres outside Veneta from 1970 through 1975, before financial problems and internal conflicts had caused it to dissolve. The records were sparse, the kind of informal documentation that characterized the Back to the Land movement, but Chen found references in old newspaper articles and county records to approximately 30 people who'd lived there at various times. One name appeared in a missing persons report filed in Lane County in August of 1972. Melissa Hartley, 19 years old, last seen at New Dawn Commune on August 4th of that year. The report had been filed by her parents in California, who'd received a concerning letter from Melissa mentioning that she wanted to leave the commune but felt unsafe, that someone there frightened her though she hadn't specified who. When her parents hadn't heard from her for 3 weeks after that letter, they'd driven to Oregon and found that Melissa had left New Dawn, according to the residents, hitched a ride to Eugene with the intention of catching a bus to California, and hadn't been seen since. The investigation in 1972 had been perfunctory, hampered by the commune members' distrust of police and their vague, unhelpful answers to questions about Melissa's departure. She'd been an adult, free to come and go as she pleased, and without evidence of foul play, the case had been classified as a voluntary missing person and filed away. Her parents had searched for years, had never stopped believing something terrible had happened to their daughter, but had both died in the 2000s without ever learning her fate. Chen requested that cadaver dogs be brought to the property where New Dawn had existed, though it had changed hands 3 times since the commune dissolved and was now owned by a family who'd built a modest house and raised chickens and knew nothing about the property's history. The dogs alerted in 2 locations near what had been the commune's garden area, and excavation revealed skeletal remains at both sites. One set belonged to someone who'd been dead approximately 50 years, buried without ceremony in a shallow grave that had been forgotten by everyone except perhaps the person who dug it. Dental records identified the remains as Melissa Hartley. The second set of remains belonged to another young woman, identity unknown, buried in similar fashion at similar depth. DNA testing revealed nothing because she'd never been reported missing, had disappeared so completely that no one had filed reports or provided samples for comparison. She became Jane Doe, another victim of violence that had occurred during a time when young people moved freely across the country, and communities like communes attracted both idealists seeking utopia and predators seeking vulnerable targets. Michael Russo was charged with 2 additional counts of murder in February of 2024. He was transported from prison to Lane County for arraignment, where he sat silently while prosecutors detailed evidence connecting him to both deaths. He'd been a founding member of New Dawn, had been present when both women disappeared, had been the last person seen speaking to Melissa Hartley on the day she supposedly left for California. He pleaded guilty to both charges as part of an agreement that spared him the death penalty, and in his statement to the court offered no explanation beyond saying that he'd been a different person then, that drugs and ideology and the lawlessness of commune life had created conditions where terrible things seemed justifiable or even necessary. The statement satisfied no one, least of all the Hartley family who'd spent 52 years wondering what happened to their daughter and were now represented by Melissa's younger brother, the only surviving immediate family member. He stood in court and read a victim impact statement that detailed the decades of not knowing, the birthdays and holidays spent wondering if Melissa was alive somewhere, the way hope had curdled into resignation and resignation had hardened into bitterness. He said he felt no relief in finally having answers, only rage that justice had taken so long and that Russo would die relatively peacefully in prison, while Melissa had died terrified and alone at 19 years old. Steven Brodie's case had solved itself, and 2 others in the process had pulled buried secrets into light and given families the closure they'd stopped believing possible. But closure was a word that meant different things to different people, and for those who'd loved Steven and Melissa and the unidentified woman whose name would never be known, closure felt less like healing and more like the final acknowledgement that time moved in only one direction and couldn't undo the violence that had shaped their lives. Chen retired from Eugene Police Department in 2025 after 32 years of service, and at her retirement party, she spoke briefly about the Brodie case and how it had reminded her why she'd become a cop in the first place, not for the dramatic arrests or the headlines, but for the quiet satisfaction of giving people answers, even when those answers brought more pain than peace. She kept copies of all 3 case files in her home office, occasionally pulled them out to review when she needed to remember that patience and persistence sometimes paid off, that cold cases weren't really cold, but simply waiting for the right moment and the right technology and the right person to refuse to let them remain buried. The warehouse in the Whitaker neighborhood stands as Eugene changes around it, and sometimes people who know the story walk past and wonder what it means that a body can be hidden for 40 years in a city that prides itself on community and progressive values and the particular Northwestern ideal of looking out for one another. The answer, uncomfortable as it might be, is that terrible things happen everywhere and can remain hidden anywhere if someone is determined enough and lucky enough and willing to live with the weight of what they've done. Steven Paul Brodie's gravestone in the Eugene Cemetery is simple, listing his birth date and the date he disappeared rather than the date he died, because no one knows exactly when that was, and it seemed important to mark the last moment anyone saw him alive. People still leave flowers occasionally. Students from the university who've heard his story and feel connected to a victim who was their age and studying at their school and living the same kind of life they're living now. The flowers are a reminder that memory persists even when the people who hold it directly are gone, that stories get passed down and take on weight through retelling, that 40 years isn't long enough to erase the significance of a life cut short and hidden away.